to make sure you guys can ask questions, because there is a lot of information and I want it to be tailored to you. I want you to walk away with this with an ability to ask questions about it, be curious about it, and even get, further knowledge about it. So my goal is really, like I said, to help you understand the process of how FDA approves cancer drugs, because it's not like every other drug, and why some drugs get rejected or withdrawn, and discuss the research that's happening. So obviously we won't go into the details that were in the other sessions, but we'll go into more of the regulatory detail and Medicare details. And I picked this little pamphlet up at the front. It also tells you a little bit about how drug clinical trials are approved. So pick that up. Melody and her team put it together and it's quite good. So great. So I'm gonna start with an interactive question first. What takes about 10 years, costs at least $1 billion, and it involves at least 300 people? I'm gonna ask for a show of hands. Who thinks it's A, building a new hospital? Okay. Who thinks it's B, developing and approving a new cancer drug? Okay. So should I even go to C? You all raised your hand.
Somewhat leading question.
Right. You're right. It is, it probably costs more to actually get a drug to market than to build a hospital or to train a team of specialists or create a support organization.
And it certainly costs more to bring a drug to market than it does to build an insurance plan and cover patients. And that's something that patients don't realize, is that, yeah, insurances are an incredibly big and expensive machine, but drug development is extremely big. And it takes huge numbers of people to do what we do.
Yeah. So how does the FDA approve your drug? And like, Dr. Dimitri, I'm glad Demercy's presentation was very timely, because he did say you each have your own journey, and this might not all apply to, this will apply to all the drugs that go through to become ocular melanoma drugs. So this is a slide from the FDA, and I know you can't read it, but I'm gonna go through it and highlight the important parts of it. So there's two big buckets in when you're developing a drug. There's the preclinical side, which that was more where I started, and then the clinical side where Ross kind of started. And the preclinical side is really where, if you saw that slide from Dr. Dimitri, where you had all those little bubbles with all those 3-letter acronyms of like the proteins and the enzymes that are involved in the pathway. Well, some researcher picks one of those little bubbles and said, I think that's the bubble that's going to cure cancer. I think that's the one that's going to cure the tumor cell. And then they work to make it, to extract it, to make it stable, to make it be allowed to be in a liquid or tablet form. They test it in a petri dish on cancer cells, and then the FDA requires that we go into 2 animal species. Now sometimes you can get away with 1, but usually you have to go into 2 animal species before you actually can do what's called an IND application, where you take all that data, and that's about 6 to 10 years of work right there, all that data, and you submit it into about a 60-page application of, here's why I think we can use this drug that we've put together in humans. And here is the protocol that we're gonna test to see, 1, in phase 1, if it's safe, and what dose we're gonna use. So we do have in preclinical a human equivalent dose. So once we've done our studies in 2 species, we actually have a mathematical formulation that tells us what the human dose should be. But the phase 1 is where we see, is it safe in humans? And do we have the right dose, the right frequency? Is it once a day, twice a day? Is it once a week, once a month? all of those things are phase 1. Now, phase 1 in non-cancer diseases is healthy volunteers that are in usually a unit. It's very short trials, and it's about 20 to 80 people. In oncology, it's usually 12 to 40, and it's done in cancer patients. So it's a very different type of study that's designed in oncology and cancer than in non-cancer trials.
So to level set on preclinical and phase 1, Aura for the first 3 years never put anything in a patient. It was 2 labs in a small building in Boston spending millions of dollars trying to make that 3-dimensional sphere ball that Dr. Demirci just showed you safe and manufacturable enough in order to even put it into rabbits in the case that we were working with, and then unfortunately dogs, which makes me very upset, but it's sometimes the case. But the dogs became pets to somebody else, so it's okay. They just had to have a lot of injections in their eyes and blood drawn. So, okay, well, we'll skip on the dogs and never mind. Somehow I get stuck on that because I love dogs. I don't know. I'm sure we have dog lovers in here. But anyway, and so there's components of that that are really interesting, and I think people, when I talk to my friends, colleagues that don't understand drug development, I basically say, we're just making sure the drug is not super toxic in those animals. It doesn't kill them, but it also, we draw their blood and don't see markers in the blood that suggest that it could be hugely toxic in humans. So that's really the big thing that FDA or EMA or these regulatory agencies, government agencies are looking for. And then you submit that to them with the IND, and then they'll say, okay, we think this is good enough, safe enough now that you can test it out in humans. So when you do get to that first testing stage, you have no idea if it's going to work on the disease, but you're hoping it will be. So now you're talking about all the money that's going to go in just to get you to the place where you're going to say, I'm going to put this in a human and hope that I see something, or at least make sure that they're not going to get really sick from it. Oh man, that in itself, why would an investor want to give you money for that? So it really is so challenging to get going, which is why the big pharmas have the ability, because they have money in the background already, to do these studies, whereas small companies like us who say, we want to focus on choroidal melanoma, investors kind of scratch their head and go, huh? So it really is, it's an amazing process, and truly, if I had more time, and I told some folks yesterday the story of the founder of Aura, it's really pretty amazing stuff. And then, and interestingly enough, in phase 1 in cancer, it's often the case that the drugs themselves are toxic. Chemotherapies are pretty toxic, as you know, and so that's why they're not healthy volunteer studies. They're basically, hey, let's test this out as an opportunity in patients with cancer.
So has anybody been in a phase 1 here? No? Okay. One of the other hallmarks of a phase 1 is that you will see that there's a lot of blood draws usually, and you'll have one at like right after you take the drug.
30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours.
And that's what we call PK. You'll hear pharmacokinetics or PK drug draws, and that's because we're trying to establish how fast the drug gets degraded, in your body. So that's one of the hallmarks of. Okay.
If you want a handheld.
Yeah, I was gonna sit down.
Here you go. It's okay.
It's much more of a conversation if I sit down, right? So then after that, we go into phase 2, which sometimes in oncology we can do a phase 1-2 because we're already in patients. So we might sometimes combine those two if, like Ross says, we have good preclinical data, we have a good inkling that this drug works in humans, and so we can get away with a phase 1-2 of 75 to about 150 people. And the FDA in rare diseases has approved phase 1-2s in 75 to 150 patients.
Occasionally.
Yeah, so I had a rare drug in soft tissue sarcoma. There was nothing out there, and it got approved on the phase 1-2 with 85 patients. So that happens, and we'll explain why that happens and how that happens. But at the end of phase 1, there is a meeting with the FDA. It's called an end of phase 1 meeting, and we'll talk about that, where the FDA is really our partner and our teammates throughout the whole thing, looking at the data, making sure that it's safe, it's the right dose, it's efficacious. And the phase 2 is where we start collecting efficacy data. And then, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say the FDA can be a very tough friend. It's your friend that wants to give you a hard time,
Yeah.
but still wants to be your friend. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tough love.
Yeah, tough love from the FDA.
Yeah. And then the phase 3 is, here it says thousands of patients from the FDA. Again, that's in, non-oncology diseases. If we go into phase 3 for oncology diseases, it's hundreds of patients. So the Kimtrack drug was approved on like 385 patients. The FDA does have this kind of unwritten rule that they want to have 300 patients worth of safety data that we always hear. And that phase 3 is really, it's called the confirmation stage because it's really the study which shows that your drug is going to be better than the standard of care. If there's no standard of care, it's going to be better than what's out there right now.
The challenge, however, is sometimes the FDA will come back and say, well, let's redo that. Or we're gonna ask you to do another phase 3. And there's always reasons behind it, but it's not as straightforward as this, although you hope it is. And in rare diseases too, the numbers tend to be less also, which is another good thing, is that FDA may only ask for 50 or 100 patients, but then it's a rare disease, so finding those 100 patients is challenging. This is why it's really important for you to encourage your colleagues out in the world of both diseases and rare diseases, and then those who you might hear of that have ocular melanoma or it's a new diagnosis, to encourage them to pay attention to the clinical trials, because you're taking an already small pool of patients, and then there's criteria both on an inclusion and exclusion, and it gets more narrow and more narrow and more narrow, and we're doing everything we can to try to get these patients in so that we can get the results of the study and then help a wider range of patients. So, yeah.
Yeah, one question I have, I guess, about the criteria for selection, approval, and who can actually participate in this. In rare cancers like uveal melanoma,
Right.
How does the FDA or the drug company itself make any kind of, adjustments for your population pool that you actually have to work with?
Yes and no. So yes, that there might be a little more broad in terms of the way they approve patients to come in, but still rigid enough to suffice what they're looking for to prove that the drug is both safe and that it's efficacious or works. So it's not as wide as we might hope, unfortunately. And that's just the reality of the FDA is very open-minded in understanding that diseases are rare, but also wants to be sure that what you're giving them works, and that from their standpoint, the thing that they're most concerned about is that it's safe. And so it's pretty hard to do. And even in uveal melanoma, in our case, in Aura, we're working specifically on choroidal melanoma. Unfortunately, it's too difficult to visualize growth patterns in iris and ciliary body tumors. So our first approval is really looking at just choroidal melanomas, and that you narrow the pool even more. So.
And that's a great question as we get into targeted medicines, because as we get into targeted medicines, these numbers have become smaller because not all patients have, the BRAF mutation. So the FDA wants, if the drug is targeting BRAF, they only want patients with BRAF to enter the drug, because they wouldn't know how safe it is for people who don't have BRAF, right? Because we're targeting that specific, and logically, it shouldn't work with people who don't have the mutation, because that's what the drug is targeting. So,
on the flip side, for our current trial, you don't need to have a genetic profile. So it's nice to know, but you don't need the biopsy, because whether or not it's a class 1 or class 2, if it's growing, we're gonna try to stop it from growing.
which I was really encouraged by the new studies and really stop growth. So I'm going to go through this one quickly because we'll get to the other ones a little. The other ones are more interesting. This is once we have all the data from the phase 2 and phase 3, we actually create a drug label, which tells you who can take it, and it's basically your inclusion-exclusion criteria from the phase 3 that kind of drive your drug label. And then you submit an application, which takes about 8 to 9 months for them to review, because you can imagine it's hundreds of pages of data that we've collected. And you can either have if they're not sure, you might have a review meeting with the Oncology Development Committee, which is ODAC. If they're pretty
Which you don't want.
Which you don't want, because that means they found some inconsistencies in your data. Otherwise, they actually don't give you the approval before you have some inspections. And I spent 5 years in Lilly just doing FDA inspections. That was my role. I was head of inspection readiness for oncology. So they will inspect your manufacturing, they will inspect a couple of sites, and they will inspect also the sponsor site and all your data. And then once that is done,
There's no stress there.
yeah, there's a lot of stress. You have about 6 months, and when the approval comes, because they again review all the data. So it can take a really long time. If you think of when that scientist thought that, that protein was helpful to when you actually get to the FDA approval. I know one of the drugs that I saw all the way through, our scientist had his baby girl when he discovered the drug, and she was finishing university when the drug was approved. So that is the human life cycle of a drug.
Yeah, and you need humans to stick with it.
Yeah.
People who create the drugs and are passionate about this, if there's not continuity in those teams, it makes it harder and harder, because there's changes and different relationships are built, and science and education will change over time, and so it's a long drawn out process. And one thing we'll touch on a little bit later, but I like to sort of set the stage now, is we go through all of this and FDA says, okay, we believe you, your drug is approved, here's your label, and we go through this negotiation of what the language will be in that label. And then Joyce has sat through many a meeting with me at work where I remind everyone that all of that is great and well, but then we have a whole nother process outside of that, which is the insurance companies, whether or not they're gonna pay for the drug for patients. And so people, I'd say folks don't realize this who aren't in the medical community, and why should you, is that you have FDA, which is a government body, and all FDA cares about is whether the drug is safe and that it works. And from their standpoint, you're on your own after that. And that's where it becomes really challenging, because even if you are given that stamp of approval, insurance companies may think something completely different. And then it becomes a whole huge process of trying to get it through, and you probably have all dealt with that in some fashion or other, denials and insurance resubmissions, and then step-off edits and prior authorizations and all the things that occur in that world, and then negotiations on pricing and co-pays and co-insurances. So that's a huge part of the process that we also spend many, many hours and many dollars trying to optimize that for patients. Really, genuinely, knowing, being a patient myself, having family members who are patients, really work hard on this, and that's a global effort. The US is so different than the rest of the world, and so not to go on a long tangent, but it's interesting to know that here it's a privatized organization, except for CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid for the most part, but even that's privatized in a way, that you all, I would say who in here does, everyone here has private insurance of some form or other, I would imagine, right? And so, and you probably all, as many people there are in here, as many different insurance plans that are represented by both in this room and probably the other 20, 30 different types of insurances. And so we have to go and talk to them and educate them and convince them that we should be in a certain position and why it should be there, what's the reason for it, and that's in the US. And then when you go outside the US, it's the governments that you have to work with. And for there, it's value-based systems. So they want to know that there's an improvement in patient care, an improvement to the system that will help allow them to feel confident that spending whatever it costs to reimburse for the drug will be useful for patients. And you're looking at that 10-year process, it takes us 10 years and 1 billion. Otherwise, if we don't charge something for these drugs, you're gonna go out of business, you can never make them. So that's where the whole argument around drug pricing is skewed, to say, oh, drugs are really expensive, but what about all this work that goes into it? If a company can't recoups some of that, there's no business there. And so it's a challenge to try to make folks understand that we're doing everything we can for patients and also have to be able to sustain that process and keep manufacturing of a drug alive. So not to go too long on that, but we'll talk more about it, but just to sort of set the stage.
I'm so glad that I end at 12. I end at step 12, like, that's all his department and stuff when, in his, Med Affairs deals with that. I'm in research, so step 12 is where I drop off, which is nice.
Yeah, and as a physician, that's where it's easy for me to pick up, because I know the process, I know what happens for patients, I know what happens on the patient side and on the clinician side, and then I go within the scientific argument with the business argument to try to help make it available for patients, and we really work daily on that.
And here's the sunshine that the FDA has given us a little bit. They've given us a few, this is really important for rare diseases. They've created these programs called Fast Track, which is a program where the FDA actually reviews more steps in your process and is telling you faster if you're on the right track. You can ask them more questions, you can have more meetings with them. Orphan indication, uveal melanoma, any disease that affects less than 200,000 patients in the US, it actually becomes an orphan indication for the FDA, which also means that you get that 9 months of review actually can become 6 months of review. Breakthrough therapy. So that's for drugs that show major improvement. So the Kimmtrak, again, was a breakthrough therapy, and because it was going to be the first one in uveal melanoma, so they were actually allowed to go much faster through the different phases to get it to patients because there really wasn't anything in the field. So we have to apply for these. Accelerated approval is also, you can also apply for, you can have many of these, you can have all of these for a drug. It is rare to have all of these, but you can have many of these, and you actually get through the development process much faster. So instead of it being 10 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 4 years. So that's the kind of the benefit. And we have to write long documents and apply.
You read my mind, that was what I was gonna say. You write these massive documents because that's what these bodies require, and you have to be very creative in your argumentation. You have to be very to the point, you need to use literature, but you also have to make a creative storyline as to why they should give us these things that you're listing here, and they are tough.
And
really
patients are really important in this, because I know, again, for some of the ones where we had orphan, breakthrough, and fast track, the patients' advocacy groups wrote letters to the FDA.
Yeah.
And they actually asked for it. And they sent cases, they sent, patients from the phase 1, patients sometimes from the phase 2 sent cases of how it helped their life. And what they want to see is how did this improve your life? There's a lot of a good storyline they look for in these applications.
And actually, I think it's interesting to say, when we say they, what does it really mean? What does it mean? What is FDA they? So
That's a good.
yeah, I'll narrow it down a little bit. It's actually, it really comes down to a small group of people at the FDA that are deciding upon your process. So the FDA has many different divisions. I've worked with the cardio-renal division, I've worked with the oncology division, I've worked with the rare disease office, and I'm sure you've worked with many of the different offices. CBER, CDER, endocrinology division. So they kind of all have their own little niches to what they work on. And so in this case, it's the oncology division, of course, that we're working with. And what they do is they'll assign a team. And that team could be the director of the oncology division or the deputy director and then scientists. So the director or the deputy director is almost always an MD. That's full-time working for the FDA. Usually they live around DC, they trained around there, and then they end up, they could be an oncologist, they could be an internist, they could be a surgeon. It just sort of depends.
Yeah.
Most of the time they're trained in the specialty that they're working in, or they're a general practitioner. And they assign to your program. And when we say they, the truth is, for the most part, that it's that MD who's making the decision on the approach they want your program to take. So it's really kind of us as an organization negotiating with that one person. And we need to get to know them, and hopefully they get to know us and realize we're coming from a good place. And if they don't, or it doesn't go well, it can really change the dynamic of the conversation. But if it does, then it helps to open that line of conversation. Not that they won't follow the rules, they obviously very much do, but at least it can be a more amenable. So when you say they and what the FDA, now you guys can actually have a perspective of saying, actually it's kind of just one person with a small team on that drug in that division, in that office within the FDA. And sometimes the higher ups, like the FDA director, the chairman, will get involved in, I don't know if they call
Especially
it.
for these.
Yeah, something that's either rare cancer, might have national news, then that's where they might get involved and put their opinion on the process. I've had it a couple of times where they've gotten involved and written a letter. And sometimes when you ask them, hey, can we bring a patient to our FDA meeting? And those are very formal, most of the time. Sometimes you can have it informal. But most of the time they're very formalized meetings. You provide a book ahead of time, you have a list of attendees, you submit a PowerPoint presentation or a document that you're going to use as a guidance for those meetings. You can ask to bring a patient. Sometimes they will say yes, sometimes they will say no. It just depends on the nature of the conversation. I would say I've had more no's than yeses in bringing patients. I don't know what your experience has been. Yeah. Which is crazy, right? Because they run patient panels and they have patient meetings, and you would think that if we're working to treat you, that you should be there. But that said, it really just depends on the nature of the conversation.
So we'll go through this next slide, which kind of summarizes everything we've said, and then we'll pause for questions, because then, you'll have understood the process and we can go into why they reject or withdraw drugs. So again, I took this from the FDA site, and I'm just gonna kind of walk through, but so you have your preclinical studies, your IND submission, which is your phase 1, and you're already talking to that person at the FDA and their team. They've reviewed your protocol, they've reviewed your animal data and all your toxicology data, and they've approved the phase 1. At the end, they do an end of phase 1 meeting, which then they review all the data. And you could, if you decide that you're doing a formal, I guess, stop between your phase 1 and your phase 2, you take all your phase 1 data and you say, hey, this is what we got, this is what we want to do for the next phases. And then the traditional way, you do your phase 2 and you have an end of phase 2 meeting, and then they say, yep, this looks like a very promising drug. If you can reproduce those results in your phase 3, you've got something, right? You can submit your package and we'll consider it for approval.
I'll pause there just to interrupt for a second. Sorry to interrupt, but so it seems like it's pretty straightforward. You have that meeting, they're happy and all looks good, and then we start opening up our clinical trial sites. Not exactly. So they say, okay, we like your data and we like your idea. Go ahead and move forward. Submit us a protocol, finalize what you to be version 1 of your final protocol to execute that study in 6 months. Okay, we could probably get that done in 2 or 3 months internally. So we'll work really, really hard. It'll be 10 people on the team, and we'll write this whole long protocol, and it makes me nauseous just thinking about writing one of those protocols. Good thing I have lots of helpers. Yeah. Yeah, and then we'll submit it, and then 2 weeks later we won't hear anything, and 2 weeks later again we won't hear anything, and then we bother them and we call them and how's it coming along? Oh, we're on yours today. We had 3 ahead of you. We're understaffed, government shutdown, and it's true. These things really do happen. It's not their fault. They just don't have the staff, and so then you get the protocol back and you see their changes, and you go, oh, we disagree with this change, we need to have another meeting. So then we submit the meeting request, and then it takes a week to get the meeting request back. And these are just very normal processes that occur. And then you do meet, and then you talk about that protocol change. Then you submit another edit, and that takes 2 weeks for that edit to come back. And then you finally have an agreed upon protocol, and then you can start your phase 3. So it's a complex process.
It is a push-pull, right?
Yeah.
We don't agree necessarily on everything they say. We know the drug. Our researchers sometimes say, hey, if they want this particular patient to be excluded or included, you know, it won't work because of like the preclinical data. So it is a negotiation, and usually we, you know, if the studies go forward, we've, you know, had a good negotiation.
Yes. One that we normally lose.
Ah.
I'm kidding.
They're
No. You can come to a good
you
agreement.
can come to a good
generally.
agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, look, you have good FDA teams and you have bad FDA teams. Like you have a good car salesman
Yeah.
and you have a bad car salesman, right? In every kind of walk of life, you can have, and it's forming that relationship and kind of working with them. So when I start in this stage with, you know, the companies I work with, I always say, let's go to the FDA early and start the conversation. If they
Yes.
don't like something like here, it's gonna come out here and here, and we're gonna have problems, right? So let's start those conversations
Earlier
really
you start,
early.
the happier FDA will be.
Yes. So what we showed about the breakthrough and what's significant here is you see that if we get like a breakthrough indication or fast track or orphan, we're shortening that timeline and getting it to you faster. And we can actually do our submission for drug approval on a phase 2. And they usually say, okay, we're approving it on the phase 2, but you still have to do a phase 3, but your drug's gonna be on the market, available to the patients that have that rare disease.
It is the best thing that can happen. When that happens, the company is thrilled because now we've just shortened the amount of time and work we can do to get this to patients and then actually start really looking at it in a more real world sense as compared to this rigid, narrow clinical trial. Does not happen often. Does not happen often. And you were probably gonna say this anyway, but you might do your phase 3, get approved, and then they still give you another study to do, even when you're on the market after a phase 3, where that little box says post-marketing
Right.
requirements.
And that kind of gets us into the next, we saw that, the next question. What percentage of cancer drugs that enter phase 1 eventually get FDA approval? Does anybody wanna take a guess?
D.
D?
D, as in dog.
Okay,
Yeah.
who says A?
No one.
No one, okay. Who says B?
I can't read the iPad eyes, so I can't see the.
Okay, so it's 1 in 2, 50%. 1 in 4, 25% is B. 1 in 8, 13%. Or 1 in 20, 5%. 5%? Okay, hold your answer. We will kind of circle back. So this was one of the reasons, so I went through the whole beginning of the development phase so you could understand this part, because this was what Melody said was really, she got a lot of questions from the patients, is why do drugs sometimes get failed or get removed from the market? And you have to understand the kind of beginning part to be able to get to this part. And so, I don't know if you guys can see this well. It looked better on a small screen than a big screen.
Yeah, because it's bright.
Yeah.
It's yellow, it's-
So the main reason that drugs don't get approved, so that it goes once you've submitted your package and they say no, you cannot take it to the market, is that 60% of rejections are because they're comparing it to what's currently on the market and they don't feel it's an improvement. So it doesn't help patients live longer or feel better compared to the existing treatment. Because usually in your phase 2, you are comparing your drug to what exists and showing that it works better. And if there's nothing that exists, you're showing that it'll make patients' lives better. Yes?
Yeah.
More need, lower bar to cross.
It's a good question. It's kind of a multi-part answer, really, because it's an orphan drug, orphan disease, excuse me, and it has incentives from the FDA, quicker turnaround times, possibly exclusivity on the market for a 7-year period, depending if there are not other drugs, and the patent is either available or not. So there are some of those incentives. There's tax incentives for companies to develop in rare disease, because the fact is that there's a small patient population and it's challenging. So yes, that's part of it, really. And the other part is that we want to work in unmet medical needs. And working in unmet medical needs gives us the opportunity to be the one and only in that disease state. And by doing so, it's just a much easier process to market. You're not competing with others for relationships, for education, for trying to show your drug is better or worse than something else. So absolutely correct. And to your question, something, if you looked at, now that they're all over the counter, but years ago, Prilosec versus Nexium versus any of those different drugs, or there's so many of them, Dexalon, and it's kind of, how are they different? Well, how does it work differently in a patient, or is it really just how do they all capture market share, and is there enough of a market for them to make money? So, and that's different than here, where we're trying to say, let's reach the patient, let's make a big impact here in an area where we're not gonna have to worry about all the rest. If we work, we can get it to patients, so yes.
Yeah, and I'll answer that from the research side. If you watched the presentation this morning, they went through, Dr. Metarin. He explained that for the first 20 years in ocular melanoma, there was very little research, very little information, very little breakthroughs. It wasn't of interest. So if you think that preclinical part wasn't happening as much, it's only in the last 10, 15 years that people have found pathways, found genetic mutations, found things that they could research and create a drug to actually get the disease. And you're now seeing the fruits of those labors.
Yeah, you read my mind. I was going to say science and technology is
Yeah.
allowing for some of these rare diseases first to be discovered, because 10 or 15 years ago, many of these rare diseases weren't even identified. Rare cancer like choroidal melanoma may not was identified, but there are others, that genetic diseases that weren't. And so then you do, and then it's taking 10 or 15 years to make the technology to get it to the place to put it into patients. So that's another reason. Interestingly, and I'll tell you why Aura. I'm talking a lot. I tend to do that. If you work with me, you know I never shut up. So.
A little bit more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say, in Aura's case for choroidal melanoma, it just turns out that Belsar happens to bind most strongly to choroidal melanoma than it does any other form of cancer. So that's where the
another
company
thing,
went
yeah.
first.
The second reason is safety concerns, and Ross being VP of Medical Affairs can definitely talk to that. And I can tell you that when I was working at Delcath, the first phase 3 study, which was done in 2014, was rejected for safety concerns. So that is definitely, that's where they found that the side effects are more severe than the beneficial effects. So it's always risk-benefit that they're looking for, or there's not enough information about long-term safety. So Ross was saying that they're going to make you do another trial and another trial. They want to see that those results are reproducible. Vioxx was like the prime example, right?
Yeah.
They found a small signal before that they saw in clinical trials that was really insignificant, but when it got out to the mass population, that became a more serious event, and they withdrew the drug from the market.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones we can talk about. Testosterone replacement in men was a really good example, because I think everybody's heard about it. Is there was this concern for cardiac events, but it was never really clear. It was just more of a possibility of cardiac events, given the the science of testosterone replacement, and now, all these years later, the FDA mandated a study, a safety study, and just 3 years ago now, it was published that actually there is no increased risk of adverse cardiovascular events with the use of testosterone replacement in men. So that really can shift the whole way it's being thought of again. So anyway, those are good examples.
Yeah, and then the third one is study design problems. So those clinical trial protocols we submitted to the FDA that they said were good, actually, by the time 7 years has passed or 10 years has passed, we've compared it to the wrong drug. We looked at the wrong patients. We made it too narrow that the market now is, not in that space that we can actually,
Or the company didn't listen.
or the company didn't listen.
And I've seen this probably more than any of the other
Yeah.
situations that you talk about where, not my companies, of course, but I have seen other companies that just flat out didn't listen to the FDA's recommendations. And some of them do get through, but a lot of them, the FDA just says, look, sorry, you didn't listen, and we're not gonna approve you.
And the last one is manufacturing inspection failure. So as we mentioned, before they give you that stamp of approval, the last step is that they go and they audit everything, and your manufacturing plant, if it fails, you got that, right?
Well, we'll keep that between us,
Okay.
but that's when,
Cat's out of the bag.
yeah, that's when your clinical team cries, because you worked so hard to get this drug through, and you've made these arguments, and you've wrote these big packets, and you're feeling so good about the work you did, and scientifically, it makes perfect sense. And then some facility you use in Sweden has a contaminant in their production plant, and the FDA says, sorry, you gotta go do your trials again because there was a contaminant in something that you use, and we're not confident that it's safe.
So does then that start the process all over again from the beginning, or where?
Depends on what they find.
Okay.
It usually puts you back in redoing toxicity studies, them being comfortable with it, and then going back to a phase 3.
Yeah.
Oh, it's brutal, sorry.
So these are
But it
all-
never happened to me, but it's brutal.
So these are all recuperable, like Ross says. It's many years, and your company has to have the money to be able to get through it, but it is recuperable. I don't know if that's a word. And I'm just gonna skip over this because we don't have much time. The one that isn't, you can't kind of go back from this, or it's very hard, is when the drugs get withdrawn. And I can tell you that 70% of the drugs get withdrawn from the sponsor once the FDA has raised the red flag, and some do get withdrawn by the FDA. And that's the ones that you hear that are super public, and so.
But if you, not to back up to the previous slide, but to the process earlier
Yeah.
on, you guys all have a voice. You absolutely have a voice. In the event that you feel really strongly about a drug that you are either part of the trial or you see what's happening, and there appears to be some incomplete thought process by the FDA, and you yourself feels very strongly, you write letters, you get the rest of your community to write letters, it can push an approval over the edge. It really can. Or it can prevent a withdrawal if it's not a safety issue, it's an efficacy thing, but you had, or someone you know had good response to the drug. That set of letters, those set of responses, going to see your congressman or senator, going to try to meet with the FDA yourself, does make a difference.
Is the FDA pretty transparent about, I guess, like which drugs are being put through trials for different diseases? If I go and I look for uveal melanoma today, maybe this is something.
You can go to clinicaltrials.gov,
Okay.
and that will show you, and then search uveal melanoma, and you'll see all the different trials that are being done there. But in terms of where it is and where it stands at the FDA, that's not public until the approval process is complete.
And I hate to be the bad guy that says
Yeah.
we're out of time.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
I hate to be the bad guy that says we're out of time, but we're out of time. In this room next, we have registry updates with Melody Burchett, Marshall, Pulse Info Frame. And then in track 1, your other choice is going to be for 11 a.m. metastatic treatments and clinical trials with Dr. Salama, Dr. Matarin, and Dr. Atlas. So for the 11 a.m. session, you have the choice of the two. This is track 2, that's track 1. So you're dismissed, you can go have a bathroom.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you. If you
Thank
have
you for
questions,
listening.
come and see us. And by the way, it's 13%.
Let's take this up.
13% one.
Yeah.
The number of phase ones that,
What was the
Absolutely.
percentage?
so it's C.
13.
Oh,
13.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this would be a fantastic one.
Not the worst one, but.
No, I thought 5.
I'm gonna just.
I have one question.
We're all very pessimistic.
Thanks, you guys.
Yeah,
You do okay.
yeah. Right.
Budget cuts and research.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So,
Oh.
you, when you guys
Like, what are you
started,
doing?
you guys
Are there companies that are?
Which also changes, but yeah,
Okay, that's awesome.
Oh,
it can change and it does.
This is working with
So we were,
they love you, they know about you.
yeah,
I would
yeah.
say that
So I'll give you an example. So for this
from
drug,
April
for
till February till
this
about
team was assigned before I ever started.
everything.
I'm gonna run next door real fast and
Their leader was.
on the live, and I'll be right back.
So many companies have gone.
And he sort of set the pace for the way we're gonna do this drug.
And,
They're totally
And now the new team
yeah,
is assigned.
yeah, they are.
We're not sure if they're gonna agree with what
We're
he has.
just seeing now with the interest
Oh
rates
my
that
God.
Right.
investors have started calling companies and saying they're prepared to invest. And.
Yeah, well, she was not FDA, she was
But
NIH, so it's
they're
totally
not
different.
investing in
Yeah.
preclinical, so they want, so the investors.
So that doesn't help us at all, because she worked at NIH.
So they're investing in companies
Yeah,
that.
75% the
And
same.
how many cancers are
And
they,
this is
like,
what,
looking at?
We don't know, they don't tell us, but I would bet that they're
Absolutely.
probably on reviews of 10 different drugs.
they're writing a lot of letters to congressmen.
It's not a matter of how often we
All our
have to
government
report, it's a
people.
matter of how often we
Because
want to talk to them and how often they want to hear from
It's in
us.
10 years, we
It's
won't have
usually
drugs.
only if they have a
Right, so
problem
we
with
won't
something
have
we're doing,
anything
or
that
they,
has been.
they want a safety update. So the safety updates are required
On every
2 months, 6 months,
where
12
right
months.
now,
But that's,
a lot
that
of
just goes to
pharma
their
companies
safety
in
person, they
China,
review it
a lot
and
of
look at it.
pharmaceutical-
But
a lot of
actual
pharma
full
companies
group,
are in Europe.
yeah, right
Those
away.
companies
Usually
will
what
have
happens is
the
we have
drugs.
outside clinicians that are not,
Yeah,
that don't work with
they
the
I mean,
company.
always say
they
it's
They're
can
independent, they'll
apply.
look at the safety data,
Right,
they see
they can
something, they'll
apply
flag
Of
it.
course, I mean, and then she came in,
So usually, the FDA wants US-based.
So imagine if you have
Even
enough
though
money to
we're-
get to market, and all of a sudden
US and
FDA says,
European,
we don't like what you did, you
we
gotta
are
do another phase 3 study.
genetic pool.
Then you gotta go back to your investors and say, all right, do you still believe in us? Because now we gotta go do another 2
but yeah,
phase.
it was,
And the investors may say,
A drug.
especially like a company like ours, who doesn't have a product generating money, they'll go, the investors may say sure, or they may say forget it, guys. You're never getting this thing through,
Yeah,
so
good luck.
we're done. You never know. Yeah, most, the investors in this space, yeah, the,
yeah, well,
or they get in early hoping that the rest of the market will like your idea, bump it up, and they can sell and sell it to somebody else. It's a messed up world. Wall Street is that's a
Yeah.
totally different.
Yeah.
I get to work with those folks, and they like to hear your arguments, and they want to hear
Yes.
everything you say. And at the end of the day, all they want to know is,
Yeah.
all right, so what's the percent return going to be in 6 months based on where you
Yes.
are? And we're out. We're like, can't you know that we can't answer that.
so are your investors on both trials?
Yes.
The investors in the company, yeah.
Okay.
So they may have reasons for why they put money in. They may be more favorable towards one or the other or the whole platform, but they're in the company.
They're backing you on both.
Yeah, they're backing the
Okay,
company.
okay.
Yes, so,
Oh,
so it's the.
And we're publicly
role of
traded, so you
company,
technically
so
could
like
be an investor in us if you
Aura,
wanted to be.
They,
Oh, really?
you know.
Yeah, you could go on the
our-
market and buy us
When we
right
submit
now.
those documents
Alright,
for approval, right, we have to say,
Then
we
you could be
are
a,
focusing.
then you can talk, you can
on
call
the
my shots because you're gonna be my
for
boss.
The HLA.
If you become a majority
this
shareholder.
population, and this is where
Thank
we are
you.
Yeah, of
going
course,
to come
then.
in first line.
Biologics.
asking
This is
for
considered a
approval
biologic
because,
because it has a
yes,
viral production. You add a drug
we
to
won't
it.
be treating.
Hi, everyone.